In this video, I'm going to go over the final project grading rubric so that you can make sure you have all of the components that are required for your project. So here on the left side, we have the category, and then in the middle, we have what you need to do to be proficient. So this is your checklist. And then on the right side, we have how many points out of the total that particular section is worth. And then within each of the categories in each checkbox, they're broken down by how many points you get for those as well. The first part is the negative impact of the problem on biodiversity. In this part, you need to explain how your problem decreases biodiversity in an ecosystem. State the problem and provide a thorough explanation of the negative impact on species that are affected. You need to do this in complete sentences, and you need to be clear and concise. Concise means short, sweet, and to the point. That section is worth 6 points. The next section is about direct and indirect drivers. You did this on part 2 of the project in your outline. You need to identify and describe one or more direct drivers influencing the problem. You also need to identify and describe... She's in my class.
Oh, okay.
You also need to identify and describe one or more indirect drivers influencing the problem. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Direct drivers include invasive species, climate change, pollution, habitat change, poaching, and overhunted. So which one of those is your direct driver? Indirect drivers include things like population growth, technology, changes in economy, globalization, attitudes towards conservation. So you need to identify at least one direct driver influencing the problem and at least one indirect driver influencing the problem. And you can look at your biodiversity and climate learning targets. That section is worth 4 points. The next section is the positive impact of the solution on biodiversity. For this one, you need a thorough explanation of how your solution increases biodiversity in an ecosystem. You need to do this in complete sentences, and you need to be clear and concise. Again, concise is short, sweet, and to the point. That section is worth 6 points. The next section is about implementation and limitations of your solution. So your solution needs to be original, so as in like you thought of it, and it needs to be able to realistically be implemented. So like, for example, if you say something like, we need to decrease carbon dioxide emissions, that is not specific enough. You need to say, what do you want the person to do to help work towards decreasing carbon emissions? So is that something like they need to drive their car less? Maybe 2 days a week they take the bus instead of their car. Then you also need to talk about the limitations of your solution. So like if you're going to say people need to drive their cars less, a limitation would be, well, that does not account for all of the carbon dioxide emissions generated by humans. So you need to talk about where that falls short and kind of what percentage that could be fixing in terms of the amount of human-made carbon emissions. You need, that section's worth 4. You need data. So you need to include at least one piece of relevant data from a reputable source of information for both human-caused changes to the environment and natural-caused changes to the environment as a result of human impact. So what that means is one piece of data for this and one piece of data for this. That section is worth 4 points. The citations need to be in MLA format. You need to use at least 3 sources. All sources need to be cited. The MLA format needs to be used for documentation, and the credibility of source needs to be evaluated. That means you need to do the CARP test for every single source. I'm now going to go over both MLA and the CARP test quickly. To put your sources in MLA format, simply type in your article here or paste in the URL. A lot of us are using websites, so you can just click on website up here and then paste in your URL, and it's going to put it in MLA format for you. Let's go back and now let's talk about the CARP test. If you want to see examples of the CARP test, go into the stream, go into the November 5th and 8th announcement, and click on CARP test on anchor text. And then you will see I've carved out all the sources here. This should be being documented on your research in part 2 of the project in your research tracker. So this is where you put your source URL and the C, the A, the R, and the P. Okay, then there's a rubric edition for the letter and for the video. Okay, so if you're going to do the letter, you need to make sure your organization is on point. Your ideas need to be presented in a logical sequence. You need appropriate transitions and less than 2 awkward transitions. Organization is worth 6 points for your letter. Your letter needs to be grammatically correct. You're writing to an elected official. They don't have a lot of time. You're asking them to do something. If you are asking someone to do something, you need to have good grammar. So less than 2 spelling or capitalization errors, no run-on sentences. For the scientific vocabulary, you need to make sure you have the correct use of the scientific words, and you need to explain them, because you can't just expect an elected official to know what all these scientific words mean. Your writing needs to be put in your own words. You need to minimize the amount of quotes. They don't want to just read a bunch of quotes from an article that they could go read themselves. You should minimize the amount of quotes, but if you do quote from your source, it needs to be put in quotation marks. So this is the addition for the letter writing. If you are doing the PSA or video contest, you need to make sure that your images that you use, you need at least 3 or more images used. One has to have relevant data. So that means like you need a graph. If you do 3 graphs, that's great. If you do 2 graphs in 1 picture, that's great. Just not 3 pictures, because one of them is not going to have data. So you need to make sure you have data in at least one of those. The images need to be connected to the information. Your layout and images chosen need to be organized and aesthetically pleasing. Aesthetically pleasing is like, it looks nice to the eye. I enjoy seeing it. They need to help the reader see the important details. It needs to be readable from a 12-inch distance. Again, that's about a ruler. There needs to be less than 2 spelling or capitalization errors. And the writing and speech needs to be in your own words. If you do some quotes from your source, they need to be put in quotation marks. Now, the editing is for everyone. Okay, so editing is where you're going to do evidence of feedback given. So this one is where you're going to show that you gave feedback to peers and you record the suggestions you make for them on the paper. This is going to happen in part 4. The evidence of feedback used. The final version of your project needs to incorporate the changes that they suggested to you, and you need to document those changes, and part 5 also has a document to do that in. So that is your final project rubric. This is how you will be graded. This is worth 50 points, so it's the same amount as a test. It's going in your test category as well.